The supply corridor smelled like recycled air and old fear. It always did. Commander Disaharo had stopped noticing the fear part about 4 years ago, somewhere between the fall of Meridian Station and the thing that happened at Galt's Ridge. But tonight the smell was back. Sharp. Animal. The kind that settles under your tongue and doesn't leave even after the coffee replaces it and the shift briefing starts and you've been professional for 6 hours straight. She stood outside processing Bay 7 and read the manifest a second time even though she'd already memorized it. Vessel designation, Calith Choir, Sorathine Diplomatic Class. Crew, 14 biological entities, classification restricted. Cargo 0. Stated purpose, humanitarian aid negotiation, Sector 9 relief conference. Reviewing officer, Commander Disaharo, Ida 7, 18 years service active. Status, pending final authorization. She folded the manifest once precisely, along the exact crease she always used, and put it in her breast pocket next to the 6 other documents she'd folded the same way this week. 18 years, 3 weeks from mandatory retirement, and they give her this. The IDA, the Interstellar Distribution Authority, processed over 400 incoming vessels a week at this hub alone. Food ships, medical transports, refugee convoys, research teams, the occasional diplomatic envoy from one of the 41 recognized alien species, maintaining formal contact with Earth's expanded network of colony worlds. Harrow had reviewed somewhere approaching 40,000 of those cases in her career. She'd approved the vast majority, flagged several hundred, turned back a handful that no one had thanked her for. She had never once been wrong about a vessel she flagged. She had also never once been able to explain how she knew in a way that satisfied anyone above her in the chain of command. That was the particular frustration of her career, the one she'd made peace with somewhere around year 11 and returned to hating somewhere around year 16. You developed a sense. A weight in the chest, a specific quality of wrongness that arrived before the verifiable data did, before the anomalous readings confirmed it, before the secondary scan showed you what your gut had already decided. Her supervisors called it intuition, which was their polite way of saying it didn't count toward anything. Her subordinates called it the gift, which was their respectful way of saying they were glad it wasn't their problem. The analysts on third shift called it Harrow's nose, which she'd heard about through Marsh and pretended she hadn't. She called it being very tired and having finally learned to trust herself. She pushed open the door to Bay 7. The Sorathine were not particularly alien, as alien species went. That was, in Harrow's experience, usually the thing to watch for. The genuinely foreign ones, the Vethkali with their distributed neural clusters, the Mrakin who experience time in 3 non-sequential directions simultaneously, the vast gas bag collectives of the Overend Drift who communicated through pressure variations across their own body mass, those you could work with. They were strange enough that everyone stayed alert. Everyone read the briefings before the intake meeting. Everyone understood, clearly and without being reminded, that normal rules did not apply and normal assumptions would get you into trouble. It was the ones who looked almost human that got people killed. The Sorathine were bilaterally symmetric, warm-blooded, bipedal, and communicated through sound waves in a frequency range almost identical to human speech. They had 4-fingered hands and eyes positioned slightly too far apart on faces that were otherwise human-proportioned enough to pass a casual glance. Their jawlines moved in a way that was just barely wrong, not wrong enough to identify without staring, but wrong enough to produce a persistent low-level discomfort in humans who spent extended time around them, like watching a video with the audio sync half a second off. They wore clothes. They sat in chairs. They used idioms that translated cleanly enough through the matrix that you stopped reaching for your translator unit after about 10 minutes of conversation, which was the exact amount of time it took to start making comfortable assumptions you hadn't earned. That was the first problem. The second problem was the one sitting across the processing table from her right now. His name, rendered as best the translation matrix could manage, was Voron. He'd given her the full designation when they started, something with 17 syllables that vibrated the air in ways human vocal cords couldn't hope to replicate, and then he'd added "Call me Voron" with a smile that lasted exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, which would read as performance. Not too short, which would read as dismissal. Exactly the right amount of time, which read as practiced. He had something in his hair, braided into it near the temple on the right side. She'd been looking at it sideways for 6 minutes trying to identify it without making it obvious she was looking. Because you learned early in this job that the things you looked at sideways told you more than the things you looked at directly. "You're reviewing the manifest again," he said. "I review all manifests." She didn't look up. "You've read it 4 times." "I read all manifests 4 times. Now she looked up. "It's procedure." Voron leaned back in his chair, an Earth-standard chair, she noted, which meant he'd done research on human furniture and human body proportions before arriving, which told her something about how much preparation had gone into this visit, and folded his 4-fingered hands on the table in front of him. He was relaxed in the way that very confident things were relaxed. The way something that had already decided it was going to win might settle into a chair and wait for the paperwork to confirm it. "We've been waiting for 3 days," he said. It wasn't an accusation. That was the thing she'd noticed about him from the first hour. Everything he said arrived without a sharp edge, filed smooth, shaped to slide past your defenses without triggering the professional resistance that an outright complaint would have triggered. "My ship's ecological systems require a stable docking environment. The longer we remain in a transit hold configuration, the more complex our internal management becomes. Your ship's ecological systems are listed as restricted information in your manifest. Diplomatic vessels frequently carry sensitive biological systems. This is standard. You know this. I know that 14 crew members not eating anything for 3 days doesn't generate the thermal waste profile your ship is currently producing." She set the manifest down flat on the table between them. "Your vessel is running hot, Voron. About 40% hotter than a ship your size with your crew count should be running at this stage of a docking hold. I've got that reading from 3 independent thermal scans taken at 6-hour intervals." A silence. Not the silence of someone caught off guard. The silence of someone who had been waiting for this specific topic and was now deciding how much to spend on the response. "We carry additional biological matter for the relief mission," he said finally. "Seed cultures, protein matrices, biological starter compounds necessary for the Harvest Accord's implementation. The specific nature of this material is—" "The Harvest Accord," Harrow said, "requires full cargo disclosure. Your manifest lists 0 cargo." Another silence, shorter, more controlled. "A clerical error. The documentation process was—" "In 18 years of this job, I have reviewed 400,000 manifests," Harrow said. "The phrase clerical error, in my experience, precedes 2 categories of situation. The first category is an actual clerical error, in which case the officer involved is usually apologetic and confused. The second category is something else." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to need to inspect your cargo hold. Today." She'd submitted the inspection request at 900. By 1600, she still hadn't received authorization from her own supervisors. Harrow sat in her office, a room barely large enough for a desk and the accumulated weight of 18 years of carefully filed frustration, and read the response from Deputy Director Cowan for the 3rd time, not because she'd missed anything, but because she was trying to find language in it that hadn't already insulted her professionally. "Commander Harrow, given the diplomatic sensitivity of the Caliph Choir's mission and the timing of the Sector 9 relief conference next week, we feel that a full cargo inspection at this stage may be premature and potentially counterproductive to ongoing negotiations. The Sarathine delegation has provided assurances through appropriate diplomatic channels. We recommend standard processing protocol. Please advise estimated timeline for release authorization. Standard processing. Please advise timeline. She'd been advising timelines her entire career. The IDA ran on timelines, on throughput numbers and quarterly metrics, and the political reality that 40 colony worlds were hungry and desperate, and the diplomatic calculus of who might feed them, was not something a field commander in Bay 7 got to disrupt because of a reading on a thermal scan, and a feeling she'd been ignoring for 3 days. She had more than a feeling. She'd had more than a feeling for 3 days, and had been filing paperwork about it in the polite institutional language that kept people from shutting you down before you could prove anything. She opened her secondary research system, the one she technically wasn't supposed to use during active case review, a policy she observed when it was convenient and set aside when it wasn't, and pulled everything she could find on the Harvest Accord negotiations over the past 18 months. The Sarathine had come to the table 2 years ago. The timing was notable for reasons anyone paying attention to colony world news already knew. 2 years ago was also when the southern colonies had started reporting a second wave of crop failures. The blight, a biochemical cascade that had torn through the engineered soil matrices of 11 colony worlds in 14 months, had been catastrophic the first time. The second wave was worse. The blight had evolved around the first-generation countermeasures, which was the kind of development that agricultural scientists had been quietly predicting and publicly reassuring people wouldn't happen. 40 million people on short rations, another 20 million on emergency distribution protocols. Earth was producing at absolute capacity and falling 8% short of minimum caloric targets across the affected worlds. Into that gap, with the timing of a species that had been watching and waiting, the Sarathine had arrived with a proposal. They could provide food, real food, they'd said in the first summit, bulk organic matter in quantities the colony worlds needed, processed through Sarathine agricultural systems and ready for immediate human consumption. The negotiations had taken 18 months of grinding, careful, politically exhausting diplomacy. 3 full summits, 7 sub-accords, 42 pages of distribution protocol. The kind of agreement that required 15 different governmental bodies to stop disagreeing long enough to sign the same document, which was, in Harrow's estimation, its own category of miracle. And now the first Sarathine diplomatic vessel was here, flagged for a standard supply conference, carrying 0 cargo on its manifest, running thermal readings that said it was full of something biological and active, and she couldn't get a cargo inspection authorized because the political stakes were too high for anyone above her grade to tolerate a delay. She stared at the thermal reports for a long time. Then she opened a xenobiology database and started reading about Sarathine physiology. She was 40 minutes into an academic paper from the Institute of Xenobiological Studies when she stopped at a paragraph in Section 4, Subsection 3. She read it again. She read it a third time. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. Then she put her jacket on and went back to Bay 7. Voren was eating when she arrived. That detail mattered more than it looked like it mattered. She had authorized a standard diplomatic provisions delivery to the vessel's waiting lounge 2 hours ago, Earth standard meal tray, the usual courtesy the IDA extended to delegations during extended holds, something between genuine hospitality and procedural box checking. He was eating it. He'd positioned himself by the viewport, the tray in front of him on the small table there, and he was eating slowly and with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He'd poured water from the carafe. He was doing the things a species did when eating was something they chose rather than something they needed, and the specific quality of his engagement with the food was different from hunger. It was pleasure. "You eat," Harrow said. Voren looked up without surprise. "I do. Your species doesn't have to." A pause, brief and considered. "That's a significant oversimplification. Saurothine metabolic flexibility allows your species to enter states of reduced nutritional need for periods of up to 40 standard cycles," Harrow said. She'd been reading for 40 minutes. "You don't require food in the way humans require food. You require it the way we require things that are good and pleasant and social. It's not survival chemistry. It's culture. Nourishment as ceremony rather than necessity." She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, because she'd stopped waiting to be invited to things in year 3 of this job. "Which means whatever is on your ship, generating 40% excess thermal load, is not food reserves for your crew, because your crew doesn't maintain food reserves. Not in storage, not at scale." Voren set his fork down. He looked at her with the particular stillness of someone who has encountered the limit of a plan they believed in. "You're retiring in 3 weeks, he said. 22 days. This is your final significant case. Probably. And you're choosing to make it as difficult as possible." "I'm choosing to do my job," she said, "which is the same thing I've done for 18 years. And my job right now is to tell you that I don't know what you have in that cargo hold, but I know it isn't nothing. And I know it's not the seed cultures you mentioned. And I know that my supervisors are willing to wave you through because they need the harvest accord more than they need to be careful." She looked at him. "But you made one mistake." The two wide eyes were very steady. "What mistake?" "You assumed that a person with nothing left to lose would behave like a person who has things left to lose." Silence. Outside the viewport, the dock was doing the things docks did. Shuttles moving in distant bays, maintenance crews moving between vessels, the endless mechanical background noise of a human infrastructure that had somehow survived long enough to reach the stars and still hadn't figured out how to adequately feed all the people it had brought with it. "Tell me what's in the hold," she said. Not a threat, an invitation. The same tone she'd used 40,000 times, the one that said she was going to find out one way or another, and the only variable was whether they got to participate in the conversation. Voren looked at his food, looked at her, looked back at the viewport. "Not yet," he said, quiet, not defiant, just honest, which was somehow harder to work with. She nodded. "Then I'm going to need to inspect the hold," she said, "and I'm going to keep filing that request until someone says yes." She filed the formal hold order at 1800. She knew it would be denied. Cowan would reject it within the hour and CC her supervisor and her supervisor's supervisor, and there would be a meeting request in her calendar, by morning framed as a welfare check, but functioning as a warning. She filed it anyway, because the record needed to show that she had, and because if she was right about this, the record was going to be the most important document anyone in this building ever produced. Then she went to find Marsh. Technician Marsh was 26 years old, had been assigned to Bay 4 months ago, and possessed the specific combination of genuine analytical ability and complete absence of political instinct that made him exactly the kind of person you wanted running an unofficial secondary analysis in the middle of a diplomatically sensitive hold situation. He was running a standard diagnostic on the thermal array when she found him, and he listened to what she needed without changing his expression, which was either professional composure or the particular calm of someone too technically focused to be easily distracted. "You want me to run a secondary isotopic breakdown," he said, "off the standard reporting pipeline. I want you to tell me if there's anything in the thermal signature that the standard automated analysis wouldn't flag. Specifically, anything that might tell us about what category of biological matter we're dealing with. And if I find something, then you tell me what you found, that's all." He looked at the array, looked back at her. He was doing the calculation she'd watched every good subordinate do eventually, the weighing of what might happen if she was wrong against what might happen if she was right, and the secondary weighing of which outcome they could live with. 2 hours, he said. Thank you, Marsh. Don't thank me until I've found something worth thanking me for. She spent those 2 hours doing the most productive thing available to her. She went back to the waiting lounge, and she talked to Voren. Not about the cargo, not about the hold or the thermal readings or the formal paperwork accumulating in her filing system. She went back with 2 cups of real coffee, earth-grown, the kind that cost 3 times what the institutional variety cost, and that she'd been hoarding in her desk drawer for the last month because she was 22 days from retirement, and some occasions warranted the expensive thing. And she set one in front of him without explanation, and she sat down and she started talking. She talked about the colony worlds. She talked about what she'd seen in her career, the good years and the bad years. She talked about the first major famine response she'd coordinated in year 3 of her service, when she'd still been a junior processing officer, and the relief convoy had come in from Earth and people had stood in the landing bays at all 3 colonial distribution centers, and some of them had cried. Not from hunger, although many of them were. From relief. From the specific sensation of knowing that the thing you'd been most afraid of was not going to happen today after all. There's a sound, she said, when a cargo bay opens and the food comes out. I've been in distribution centers all over the network, and there's a sound that happens the first moment. It's not loud. It's the opposite of loud. Everyone goes very quiet at exactly the same time. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I've heard it maybe 20 times in 18 years. It's the only time this job feels like what I thought it was going to feel like when I was 23 and I applied for it. Voren was quiet for a moment. What did you think it was going to feel like? Important, she said, and then more honestly, like the paperwork was connected to actual people. Most of the time the paperwork feels like it's connected to other paperwork. She looked at him. But sometimes you see the chain all the way through, manifest to hold to distribution to the moment the bay opens. And that's worth 18 years. That's worth 18 years, she agreed. Plus the pension, which is also quite good. Something happened in his face that might have been the Sorathine version of a smile, not the human expression, but something functionally analogous, the muscles doing a different thing that accomplished a similar communication. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because you came here trying to feed people, she said, and because whatever is on your ship, I don't believe you put it there to cause harm, and I'm going to keep blocking your clearance until I understand what it is, and I'd rather you and I understood each other while that was happening. She looked at him steadily. You have an endgame here, Voren. You planned this trip carefully enough that you did research on human furniture. You don't strike me as someone who planned an endgame without accounting for the possibility of a delay. He considered this. You're trying to get me to tell you something. I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with, she said. There's a difference. One of those serves me. The other one serves both of us. He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it for a moment. We call it the chorus, he said. She waited. He set the cup down. Not yet, he said again. I want to see what your technician finds first. Marsh found her an hour and 40 minutes later. She was still in the lounge. Voren had retreated into a careful, formal blankness after the word chorus. The blankness of someone who'd said more than they'd intended to and was waiting to see what it cost them. And she'd let him have the silence because she had a lot to think about, and thinking was easier when no one was talking. Commander, Marsh came in holding a tablet with both hands, which he didn't usually do. He was a one-handed tablet carrier under normal circumstances. You were right about the thermal signature. I ran the full isotopic breakdown. He stopped just inside the door. The heat output pattern is biological, not stored biological matter, living biological matter. The cellular signature is unlike anything in our xenobiology database. But the pattern itself, the heat generation cycle, the respiration indicators, the things I can read even without a species match, he stopped again. They're alive, Commander. Whatever's in that hold, there's a lot of them and they're alive and they're warm and they're doing something continuously. It's not storage. It's more like a habitat. Harrow looked at the readout he was holding out to her. How many? Rough estimate from thermal clustering. 1,400 to 2,000 individual organisms. Could be more depending on their density distribution. She handed the tablet back. Thank you, Marsh. What do we do with this? We document it properly and I go have a conversation. She stood. You've done good work. Log everything. Timestamp the analysis. Make sure there's a clear chain from the initial thermal scan to your isotopic breakdown. If anyone asks you about the methodology in the next 72 hours, your answer is that you ran a standard secondary verification protocol at the assigned officer's request, which is exactly what you did. He nodded slowly. Are we in trouble? I am possibly, you're not. She picked up her jacket. That's the advantage of outranking someone. You get to decide which trouble is yours. She went back to Voren for the third time that evening, and she told him what Marsh had found. She laid it out plainly. 1,400 to 2,000 living organisms, continuous biological activity, nothing in the xenobiology database, heat generation cycle that matched nothing recorded. The chorus, she said, tell me, all of it, not for the report, not for Cowan, because I need to understand what I'm dealing with and I think you need someone to understand it too. He looked at her for a long time. Then he talked. The Saurothine were, among several things that weren't on most xenobiology briefing documents, one of the oldest agricultural civilizations in this sector of the galaxy. They had solved hunger on their homeworld 9,000 years ago. Not through the patient development of crop varieties that Harrow knew from Earth's agricultural history, not through the soil engineering that the colony worlds had relied on, not through the genetic modification of staple grains that had fed the first wave of colonists. They had done it through a species. They had spent 3,000 years breeding. The chorus. The word was Voren's best translation into English. The actual Saurothine designation was a compound term that the translation matrix, when she fed it through later, would flag as culturally embedded beyond standard processing. A word that contained, layered inside it, concepts like provider, transformation, the gift that becomes other, the living that feeds the living, and several more that didn't have even approximate English equivalents. The chorus organisms were biological, fully living, warm-blooded by their own metabolic standards. They consumed nearly any organic input, soil matter, waste compounds, raw chemical substrates, and converted it, through an internal biological process that took between 2 and 6 days depending on ambient conditions, into dense nutritional material. Material that was safe for Saurothine physiology. You ran trials, Harrow said. Her voice was very careful, very level. Extensive computational models, controlled simulations across multiple biological trials, Voren, physical trials. Did you run the chorus product through a human digestive system? A silence. Theoretical models suggested. Did you physically test this in a human system? The answer was in the silence that followed, the specific weight of it. The way he didn't say yes. The way he didn't say no, because no would have been too final. The nutritional content is real, he said eventually, quietly, measurable, the compound profiles that human physiology requires. Compound profiles that human physiology requires to not immediately die, she said. That's a different question from the compound profiles that human physiology can safely process over extended periods. That's a different question from what happens when 60 million people eat nothing but this food for 8 months because it's the only thing in the distribution pipeline. She leaned forward slightly. Do you understand what I'm telling you? We're not a species with metabolic flexibility. We don't adapt to novel biological compounds the way your species does. We accumulate. We develop responses. We have population-level genetic variation that means what's fine for 90% of people kills the other 10. She stopped, steadied herself. The Harvest Accord, as currently designed, would distribute chorus-derived food products to 40 million people across 12 colony worlds as a primary food source. Silence. We were trying to help, he said. And the terrible thing, the thing she'd been half afraid of since she first started pulling xenobiology papers that afternoon, was that she believed him. Completely and without reservation. The specific quality of his voice when he said it. The weight behind the words. Whatever the Sarathine were, and whatever their reasons for the particular way they'd approached these negotiations, they had come here genuinely trying to solve a problem that was genuinely killing people. I know, she said. 40 million people who are hungry. I know, she said again. Sit with me, I need to tell you something. She left Bay 7 at midnight and walked the long route back to her office. The hub at night was a different building than the hub in daytime. During the day it was motion and noise, and the specific controlled chaos of 400 manifests, a week moving through a system originally designed for 200. At night it was corridors and fluorescent light, and the deep background hum of systems running without active supervision, and it felt like what it actually was. A machine that did not stop, staffed by rotating shifts of people who eventually went home, doing work that had no natural resting point. She'd worked the night shift for years in her 30s. She'd volunteered for it in years 6 and 7 of her career, because the night shift was when supervisors went home, and you could actually think without someone stopping by to ask about quarterly throughput numbers. She'd solved more problems on night shift than she had in all the daylight hours of her career combined. Something about the stillness. Something about having only yourself and the problem, and the time to let them sit together, until one of them changed shape. She walked past the row of processing bays and stopped outside Bay 3, where a bulk food transport from the Kalia system was sitting in standard hold pending routine verification. Through the viewport she could see the hold door, sealed, ordinary, unremarkable. Behind it were 2,000 metric tons of processed grain grown in the engineered soil of outer belt colonies, grown by people who had left Earth 40 years ago with tools and seeds, and an irrational amount of determination, and had built something out there that needed supply lines to keep existing. She'd approved the Kalia's transport 6 hours ago, 11 minutes of review. Fast for her, but appropriate given that she knew the Kalia's run, 7 years of reviewing it, knowing the cargo profile and the crew conventions and the specific way they filed their manifests, including the quirk on the 3rd page where the lead cargo officer always wrote container units in the wrong column, and corrected it in a handwritten note that had been there. The same handwriting, every shipment for 5 years. She trusted that knowledge. She'd built it carefully and it had never been wrong. She wondered, standing there, whether that was what Vorin had been counting on. Not that no one would look. But that somewhere in the chain, people trusted things they'd built carefully over time. And that trust was a door you could walk through if you arrived at the right moment with the right appearance of fitting. She went back to her office and pulled the full Harvest Accord documentation, not the summary version that had circulated through the IDA's diplomatic briefing system, but the actual accord, all 42 pages plus the 7 subaccords and 3 appendices, which she had access to as reviewing officer for the Caliph Choir, and which she'd been reading in fragments since the vessel arrived. She read it straight through, every page. Every line of the nutritional specifications in Appendix B, which were the pages written by the Sarathine agricultural team describing the chorus product output in terms that translated into human nutritional science. The translation was genuinely good. Someone had worked very hard on it. The caloric density numbers were real and substantial. The macro and micronutrient profiles were what a food scientist would call comprehensive. The colony world caloric need projections were, if anything, conservative rather than optimistic. This was not a fraudulent document. This was a document written by people who believed what they were saying, who had done the science they knew how to do, and who had produced results that were, in every dimension they'd measured, accurate. The problem was not what they'd measured, it was what they hadn't. Nowhere in 42 pages, and 3 appendices did the word trial appear. She went through it a second time looking specifically for any variation of human testing, safety validation, or comparative metabolic assessment, looking for any indication that someone on either side of the negotiating table had asked, "What does this compound do specifically in a human liver, over time, at the quantities a person on emergency rations would consume?" Nowhere. Not because it had been hidden, not because anyone had been dishonest. Because the gap was a gap, an absence where a question had never been asked, because no one on the Sorothine side had understood the question was necessary, and no one on the human diplomatic side had the technical background to know it needed to be asked. The diplomats had negotiated the calories. The chemists had verified the nutritional profiles against human dietary requirements. The political teams had managed 18 months of grinding summits with the specific competence of people very good at making agreements hold together. Nobody had sat in a room and said, "I need a xenobiologist in this conversation. I need someone who is going to look at this compound not as a nutritional outcome, but as a molecule, and trace that molecule from ingestion through metabolism, and ask what happens to it at every point in the human system." Harrow sat with that for a while. She thought about the specific structure of institutions, the ways expertise lived in separate departments that only intersected when something went wrong, the ways diplomatic teams and food safety teams and xenobiology teams operated in parallel, each very good at their own piece of the question, each trusting that someone else had handled the other pieces. Nobody had handled this piece. She thought about the 29-year-old in the landing bay, watching people cry, deciding this job meant something. She thought about what it meant to spend 18 years being the person who looked at the piece everyone else had decided was someone else's problem, and asked anyway. Then she picked up her desk phone and called Deputy Director Cowan. The formal hold order went in at 2200. This time she didn't wait for the expected denial. She called Cowan directly, at home, at 600 his time zone, which was 2200 her time zone, which meant she was waking him up. She did it without apology because she had crossed the point in her career where she apologized for doing her job. He answered sounding like someone who had been expecting a call like this eventually, and had not fully prepared for it. "Harrow, the chorus organisms in the Caliph choir's hold have not been cleared through any legitimate human food safety protocol," she said. She was standing in her office with the lights at half and the thermal reports on her desk, and the xenobiology papers she'd been reading for 4 hours in a stack beside them. "I have a biological analysis from my technician demonstrating approximately 1,400 to 2,000 living organisms in that vessel's hold, producing a compound the Sorothine have tested on their own physiology and on analogous metabolic profiles. Not on humans, not on any species with our immune response patterns, our GI architecture, our hepatic processing specifics, or our population-level genetic variation." She paused. "If we release this vessel tonight and the Harvest Accord distributes this food product to 40 million people, and those people are fine, then I have caused a 3-day delay and possibly ended my career early, and you have my resignation on your desk in the morning with my full support. If those people are not fine." Harrow, Cowan's voice, tired, political, not unsympathetic, which surprised her. "The diplomatic fallout from blocking this is recoverable," she said. Whatever is in that hold has a secondary metabolite profile we haven't characterized. It might be completely harmless to human physiology. It might be a long-term accumulation risk. It might be a short-term allergen response in a subset of the population. I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know, and the Sorathine don't know, and nobody checked. She heard him breathing. Sir, if I am right about this, and we find out I was right in 8 months when the first hepatic panels come back across 12 colony worlds, this conversation will be the most important conversation you had in your entire career. I am asking you to authorize a comprehensive xenobiology review before we release this cargo. I am asking for 3 weeks. The relief conference runs for 10 days after my retirement date. Give me 3 weeks and then you make the call. A long silence. A very long silence. What do you need from my office? Cowan said finally. The testing took 4 days, not 3 weeks. The xenobiology team was faster than Harrow had estimated, because Marsh had already done the isotopic groundwork, and because the preliminary biological analysis was specific enough that the team knew immediately which assays to run. They didn't have to cast widely. They could go straight to the question of hepatic processing and immune response and long-term accumulation, which was the question that mattered. Voren authorized full biological samples from the chorus organisms on the second morning, not because she'd asked him directly. Because she'd explained what the testing would tell them, all possible outcomes, including the one where everything came back clean, and she signed his release papers that afternoon and the harvest accord proceeded exactly on schedule, and he'd understood the same thing she understood, which was that you didn't feed 40 million people something you weren't certain of, not when the testing existed. Not when the alternative was learning you'd been wrong in 8 months when the first symptoms presented, and the supply chain was already embedded. He'd authorized the samples in a room with both of their teams present, with the formal documentation she required, and then he'd looked at her and said, "You know that this could show nothing. That I could be entirely right, and you could have delayed us for nothing." And she'd said, "Yes. And if that's what it shows, you'll be through clearance by end of day, and I'll write you the most complimentary reviewing officer's note in IDA history." He'd looked at her for a moment, and then, despite everything, he'd done the thing that might have been a Sorathine approximation of a laugh. They'd been easier with each other after that. She spent most of those 4 days in Bay 7, in the waiting lounge, talking to Voren. It turned out the thing braided into his hair was a navigational token. A Sorathine tradition, a piece of material from the first location you'd ever traveled to beyond your homeworld, kept close as a physical reminder that the distance was possible and that you had crossed it. His was from a research station on a small moon orbiting a gas giant 3 light-years from Soratha Prime. He'd been 23 cycles old, which was young by Sorathine standards, and the moon's sky at a particular angle of its sun had been a color that he said in 3 different ways and couldn't fully translate. "What's the closest word?" she asked. "The closest human concept is longing," he said, "but not for something absent, longing as a form of recognition. The feeling of seeing something beautiful and understanding that you have seen it, that you are aware of seeing it, and that awareness itself is part of the beauty." He considered. Wistful, perhaps, but wistful aimed at the present, not the past. Harrow thought about that for a moment. "That's a good thing to carry," she said. She told him about the first famine response, about the junior officer who'd stood in the landing bay, about the sound that happened when the bay opened, and she'd been 29 years old and hadn't known, yet what this job was actually going to cost her in terms of years and sleep and diplomatic friction with people who outranked her. "You have spent your entire career," Voren said, "protecting people from things that haven't happened yet." That's one way to put it. It is an unusual skill. Most beings protect against what has already occurred. "Most beings don't work in cargo review," she said. "The entire job is hypothetical. Every manifest is a question. What is this? What is it really? What does it become when it reaches the other end of the supply chain? The xenobiology team finished on the fourth day. She read the report in her office, alone, at 3:30, while the hub ran on skeleton crew around her and Bay 7 was quiet for the first time in a week. The results were the specific kind of complicated that resolved, eventually, into something simple. The chorus organisms produced in their primary output the main nutritional compound, the thing that was supposed to feed people, a substance that was genuinely, solidly, comprehensively safe for human consumption. Every test, every panel, clean results across all 12 human immune profiles in the sample set, high nutritional density, none of the allergen markers the team had worried about, none of the immediate toxicity risks. The thing worked in the most basic sense. It could feed people. But the chorus organisms also produced, in a secondary metabolic byproduct that was biologically inert in saurothine physiology, and in every analogous metabolic type the saurothine had tested, a compound the human xenobiology team designated Compound 7R. In humans, Compound 7R crossed the intestinal wall and bound, at a molecular level, to specific receptor sites in the liver. Small daily amounts, no detectable effect, clinically negligible. Medium daily amounts consumed over 2 to 4 months, manageable, mild hepatic stress markers at standard screening, detectable, treatable. Large daily amounts, consumed as a primary food source over 6 to 8 months, progressive and cascading hepatic failure, the kind that didn't show up in early panels, the kind that was very advanced by the time it presented with symptoms. She closed the report, opened it again. Read the key paragraph a third time. 40 million people on emergency rations ate whatever the distribution pipeline gave them, every day, as much of it as they could get, because they were hungry and the food was there, and that was what hungry people did. 8 months, she said to the empty room, and then, because it needed to be said out loud, we would have found out in 8 months. She went to find Vorin. He was at the viewport. The Caliph choir visible through the reinforced glass, pale and long, and built by a species that had solved hunger for themselves 9,000 years ago, using living organisms that they'd spent 3 millennia carefully breeding into the most efficient food production system in their sector of the galaxy. She sat down next to him. She didn't have the report with her. She'd memorized the relevant numbers. 60 to 70% of the affected population, she said, based on the hepatic receptor expression variation. Not everyone, just most people. He didn't turn away from the viewport. We didn't know. I know. Our models predicted. Your models were built to predict what your biology prepared them to predict, she said. You tested on your species and analogous metabolic types, and you had a gap in your models the size of everything that makes us biologically different from you. That's not malice. That's a gap. She was quiet for a moment. You were trying to help. Yes. And if this had gone through tonight, and the first wave of hepatic failures had started presenting in 8 months, and the investigation had traced it back here. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The Harvest Accord, 2 years of negotiations, the only viable path to feeding 40 million people, the entire diplomatic framework of saurothine-human relations, which was still new enough and fragile enough that this kind of thing could end it entirely. End it in a way that poisoned every future conversation about aid, about cooperation, about the particular question of whether alien species and human colony worlds could exist in anything other than calculated mutual suspicion. Vorin's 2 wide eyes reflected the dock lights. What happens now, he said, not a question exactly. Now I tell you what the xenobiology team found, she said, and I tell you that the secondary compound is isolatable. That your team and ours have been working together for the last day and a half, and Marsh has been running liaison, and the current analysis is that a 3-stage processing protocol, UV treatment, a specific temperature hold, mechanical filtration, will neutralize compound 7R at the point of output from the chorus organisms without significantly affecting the nutritional value of the primary compound. He turned to look at her. It's not a simple process, she continued. It needs infrastructure, processing facilities on the distribution end, purpose-built for this specific protocol. The engineering designs exist in draft form already. Marsh's team worked fast. She set the summary sheet on the table between them. 4 months to design, build, and certify the processing facilities. 1 month of scaled testing, then distribution can begin. 5 months. 5 months. 40 million people. Earth is covering the shortfall, she said. Not well, not comfortably, not at a level that anyone is happy with, but covering it. We've been doing it for 2 years. We can do it for 5 more months. She looked at him. And then you can feed them safely. Silence. A long one. The specific quality of a silence where someone is doing the work of revising their understanding of a situation they thought they'd understood. Why did you come to tell me this yourself? He said finally. Because you were trying to help, she said. You came here genuinely trying to feed 40 million people, and you made a gap in your testing that you didn't know was a gap. And if I hadn't been 3 weeks from retirement with nothing left to lose, you might have gotten through and we would have found out about the gap in a very different way. She paused. You deserve to understand what happened and why. Not a denial form, not a formal hold notice, a conversation. Something moved through his face. The thing that wasn't quite a human expression, but lived in the same general territory of recognition and genuine feeling. In my culture, he said after a moment, there is a term for what you are. Closest translation, the person who tells you no because they can see what you cannot. The one who holds the door closed not to keep you out, but to keep you from walking off an edge you don't know is there. He was quiet. We consider it a particular kind of trust, to be told no by someone who is seeing the full shape of what would happen if you went forward. What's the word? He said it. 17 syllables that vibrated the air in frequencies human vocal cords couldn't replicate. Something that felt, in the parts of her that could receive it, like the word guardian and the word compass, and the word home layered into a single sound. She couldn't say it back. Her throat didn't have the architecture. I understand it, she said. That's enough. The processing infrastructure took 4 months and 11 days. Harrow was retired by the time the first certified clean chorus shipment cleared the distribution inspection. She was at home in the small apartment in Vancouver she'd been slowly furnishing for 2 years in anticipation of having time to live in it. A window that looked over water, a coffee maker, a stack of books she hadn't had time to read for 15 years. Marsh called on a Thursday morning. First distribution confirmed clear, he said. He was trying very hard to sound professional and was mostly succeeding. All panels across all sites, 12 colony worlds in the first wave. Caloric targets met or exceeded at every distribution point. A pause. No adverse events. Everything clean. She stood at the window. The water was gray and moving. How's the rollout timeline looking? Second wave in 6 weeks, 22 worlds. Provisional schedule has full network coverage in under a year. Another pause. Commander, the sound you told me about, in the distribution bays. Yes. We got audio from the Kalius III distribution center during the first shipment. Someone recorded it on the ground. He was quiet for a moment. You were right about the sound. She was quiet too for a moment. Thank you for calling, Marsh. There's one more thing. A diplomatic transmission came through, addressed to you specifically, from the Sorathine delegation. A pause. The translation matrix flagged the honorific they used. It logged it as culturally embedded beyond standard processing. There was a footnote from the translator. She said it was the kind of designation given to someone who sees the full shape of things. He hesitated. She said there wasn't really a clean English equivalent, but the closest she could find was something between guardian and compass. Harrow looked at the water. The light on it was the specific gray gold of a Vancouver morning, and it moved the way water always moved, the way it had moved for hundreds of millions of years before humans had arrived and looked at it, and started asking what it was made of and how to carry it where it was needed. "Tell her she got close," Harrow said, "close enough." 3 months after retirement, a message came from Voren. Not through the diplomatic transmission system. To her personal address, which she'd given him on the last day before she'd signed out her office key and turned in her badge and told the night security officer to have a good shift, and walked out into the specific Vancouver cold of a November evening that had smelled like rain and coffee shops and the ordinary life she'd been deferring for 18 years. He'd said he might write. She'd said she might read it. They'd both understood it was the kind of thing that might or might not happen and would mean something either way. The message was long. He described the initial distribution runs across 3 of the colony worlds, the ones she'd flagged as priority in the processing facility planning documents, because their caloric deficit was most acute. He described the monitoring delegation he'd been part of, traveling to the first distribution centers, watching the chorus product move through the certified processing pipeline and arrive at its endpoints. He wrote about not being prepared for what it looked like when people who had been hungry for a long time received food. He used the word overwhelming and then corrected himself. Wrote that overwhelming was too small and that he didn't have a better one, and that this was unusual for him because he considered himself reasonably skilled at language. He described a child, a girl, he thought, though he acknowledged uncertainty about how human childhood gender presentation worked. She had been at a distribution center on one of the smaller colony worlds, one of the ones that had been on emergency rations longest. She'd been given a standard serving of the processed chorus product along with the rest of the people at the center. She'd eaten it, and then she'd gone very still for a moment, and then she had laughed. Just laughed, for no particular reason that he could identify. The way children laughed when their bodies suddenly remembered what feeling full was like. "I have studied your species for many years," he wrote. "I have read the historical records and the population analyses and the economic frameworks of your food distribution systems. I thought I understood what I was helping with. I did not. Not until that specific moment, that specific child. I understand now what you were protecting when you delayed us. It is not an abstraction. It is not a policy outcome. It is that laugh. It is the particular child in the particular distribution center on the particular day, in the particular moment when her body remembered what it was supposed to feel like. I wanted you to know that I understand this now. I think it is important that I tell you. We are building secondary processing facilities on 3 Sorathine agricultural worlds. The modified chorus product protocol is being developed for 14 additional species with identified biological sensitivity profiles. Each new species requires its own testing. Each will require time and the particular kind of patience you applied to us. I have hired researchers whose entire role is to ask the questions you would ask if you were reviewing our manifests. I have not told them this. It seemed presumptuous, but it is what I meant when I described the position to them. I called it, the ones who tell us no when they can see what we cannot. It is an honorific in my culture, as I told you. I hope you are enjoying your window." Harrow read it twice. Then she made coffee. Real coffee. The good kind which she'd stopped hoarding because there was no reason to hoard something when every morning belonged to no one's schedule but hers. She took it to the window and stood there. Outside, the water moved in the way water always moved, gray and indifferent and very old. It didn't know about the harvest accord or the chorus organisms, or the hepatic compound that 40 million people had not eaten. It didn't know about manifests or hold orders or deputy directors or 18 years of being the person in the room who said, "Wait, look again. Tell me what's really in the hold." But it moved, it kept moving. Somewhere on 12 colony worlds, people were eating. On Sorathine agricultural worlds, researchers were asking the questions she would have asked, in order to keep from making the same gap twice. On a gas giant moon 3 light-years from Soratha Prime, there was a sky that was the color of recognition, longing aimed at the present, at the beautiful thing you were aware of seeing. And a young Sorathine had once stood under it and understood for the first time that distance was crossable, and had carried that understanding close ever since. Harrow held her coffee cup and felt the specific weight of a thing completed. Not done, because done was just the end of something. Completed. The particular satisfaction of a shape that was whole, visible from end to end, that you had worked toward for so long you'd stopped being sure you'd recognize it when you arrived. She recognized it. The job had never been to know everything. It had never been to be right in a way that anyone thanked you for, or to make the politics easier, or to clear the manifests on schedule, or to retire without causing problems. The job was smaller and larger than any of that. The job was to stand in the room and ask the question that everyone else had already decided didn't need asking. What's in the hold? Tell me what's really in the hold. Not because you thought you knew, because you didn't. Because knowing was what happened after asking, and asking was the whole point, and the moment you stopped asking was the moment a gap appeared in your models large enough for 40 million people to fall through. The water moved. She drank her coffee. Outside, Vancouver was doing what Vancouver did: gray sky, salt smell, the ordinary unhurried morning of a place that had existed before her and would exist long after. And Harrow stood at her window and was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, simply and completely at rest. The ship had been full of something. She'd asked. That was enough. That was in the end everything.